Good morning, good day to everyone watching. I'm Dave Zimmerman. I'm one of the senior research fellows at George Washington University's program on extremism. I'm pleased to moderate today's discussion that's going to revisit Oslo and look how extremists abducted, sabotaged the roadmap to peace and progress between Israel and the Palestinians. I'm pleased to be joined by two distinguished experts. Our first is Amos Giora. He's an only child of two Holocaust survivors. It's a very unique story. Very successful, is currently professor at the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah and director of the Bystander Initiative there. He's a retired JAG officer in the IDF, and that's going to be very important to our discussion. He's a subject matter expert in sexual assault legal cases, national security matters, human rights matters, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, just to name a few. He's published numerous books, articles, op-eds, has appeared on numerous podcasts and in the media. And we're very pleased to have him here. Joining him will be our colleague at the Program on Extremism, Laura Burns. She's our head of terrorism research and, like me, a retired FBI agent. I've had the pleasure of working with her in the FBI and, of course, currently at the Program on Extremism. She's an expert in Hamas matters, spending over 2 decades in the FBI as a special agent, and at least half that time working Hamas investigations, either as an investigator or supervisor. I'll let both of them talk a little bit about what they've done, a little bit about their background and expertise. And so we'll start first with you, Amos. Can you tell the audience a bit about your background,
Sure,
focusing
thank
on
you.
your work?
First of all, thank you. Thank you very much for having me today. So to quickly follow up on your very gracious comments, indeed, I am the only child of two Holocaust survivors. And I saw that our host just posted an article that was published on Friday, an extraordinary story, how 4 books that my paternal grandfather took with him to Auschwitz, where he was murdered, made their way to the private library of a Nazi ideologue. And 80 years later, 10 days ago, they made their way to my apartment here in Salt Lake City. It is a remarkable and extraordinary story, and I'm deeply grateful to the Institute in Nuremberg that heads up this amazing project. With regard to what we're discussing today, I served for 20 years in the IDF's JAG Corps, and I think what's particularly relevant to our conversation are the 3 years that I served as the IDF's legal advisor in Gaza from 94 to 97, where my career reflected the yin and yang of the Middle East, dealing on the one hand with the legal aspects of operational counterterrorism, and on the other hand with implementation of the Oslo peace process. And as I say, it is indeed an honor to be with the two of you today. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, sir. Laura, can you expand a little bit about your background working Hamas?
Sure. Thank you again. And thank you, Amos, for joining us today at the program. As David said, I spent over 2 decades with the FBI investigating counterterrorism matters, all forms of terrorism. But the first decade of my career was focused solidly on the Hamas terrorist organization and its infrastructure here in the United States. I was the lead case agent on the Department of Justice's largest terrorism financing prosecution, which was the prosecution of the Holy Land Foundation and 5 of its officers for their provision of support to the Hamas terrorist organization that resulted in their convictions in 2008.
David, can I quickly add something that's really interesting here? What's interesting, she was involved in the Holy Land Foundation here. Simultaneously, I was involved in the closing of it in Israel.
Wow, I think that today's discussion with two subject matters like yourselves, it's going to be very interesting to talk about the 93 Oslo Accord. So, Amos, we'll start with you. Before Oslo, you oversaw trials of Hamas members. So what types of activities and what were your general observations about their commitment to the cause?
It's an excellent question. So I was a judge in the Gaza Strip military court from 92 to 94. My takeaway on Hamas members, those who were brought before the court, 3 things. 1, an absolute and total all-in commitment to the cause. I mean, like this, laser beam focused. 2, the ones that one interacts with, they had a clear understanding of what this was all about. I didn't feel they were blind followers. I felt they actually, understood what this was about. And 3, and maybe this will be offensive to some, but there was no doubt in my mind that for them, the motivation was the ideology, if that's the word, of religious extremism. And as I've written elsewhere, you're told not to ask a terrorist, why do you want to kill my children? But I did ask. And their response was uniform with Hamas, because, translating from Hebrew Arabic, God's will and this notion of religious extremism was as clear could be, and an all-in commitment to it, unapologetically. I think that's important to note, that they really were fully focused on, the Hamas charter, which I know people are. I'm reading now that Hamas charter doesn't exist anymore, which is, we're in polite company here, but that's not true. And the Hamas charter calls for the destruction of the state of Israel, full stop. But they were locked in on it. And it's probably the wrong word, but one respected their commitment to the cause, which also imposed enormous hardship, not only on them, but on their families also. But it was this absolute and total dedication, commitment to what they believed was the right path. And I think that's important to state about them. They were absolutely unapologetic. I think that's also important.
And when you were working with these Hamas members, what types of violations were they committing that you were involved with?
X number of them murder cases, but the murder of Israelis, which, fine. But the ones that really intrigued me was the way they would go about killing suspected informants. That, I think, was really important, because Lara knows that an informant who's been outed or suspected of being a traitor within the cause, the death that they will have is beyond imaginable. And that was important for them in terms of, if you were cleaning the ranks, and more importantly, sending a clear message to other potential suspected collaborators. The other crimes were, whether it was acts of terrorism against us, acts of terrorism against Palestinians, membership in Hamas, the full range of crimes of which suspected terrorists are arrested, interrogated, questioned, and then prosecuted, and if convicted. It was, full range from membership, right, to murder, in some cases, multiple murders, because that's what this was all about.
Thank you. So we'll shift, Laura. When we talk about the signing of Oslo, what do we know about Hamas's reaction?
Well, before the signing of Oslo, Hamas was really involved in not just focusing their activities on the destruction of the country of Israel, but more importantly to them in that period was overcoming the Palestinian Liberation Organization's control over this whole intifada mechanism. So you had this uprising, and Yasser Arafat and Fatah, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, they were in charge of that. And Hamas didn't like that. Hamas wanted to get credit for this uprising and basically control the Palestinian population and control this whole movement, right? And so when the Oslo Accords were signed, that meant that there was the Israeli government and then Yasser Arafat on behalf of the Palestinians signed this agreement saying, we're going to compromise and we are going to pursue a path to peace and self-rule, Palestinian self-rule, as well as, the roadmap to a two-state solution where the Palestinians would have their own state. And there was a lot of hope in the area, in the entire Middle East region, and even in the United States about the possibility for hope. But Hamas was furious for two reasons. One, in Hamas's charter, they clearly state that they seek the destruction of the country of Israel and that there is no room for compromise, that the only solution to the Palestinian question is through jihad. You either die for the sake of the cause, you either win or die trying, right? And so they came out immediately and said, we will derail these accords. And the US-based infrastructure here had a conspiratorial meeting where they talked about just that. We will derail the accords. And this is how, we're going to go about supporting that effort in the United States. But interestingly, the Hamas leaders in the United States focused heavily on not just defeating the accords, but undermining the Palestinian self-rule. They did not want the government to succeed. They did not want the Palestinian Authority to succeed. And in fact, one of the quotes from this conspiratorial meeting where they're talking about how terrible the compromise was, they actually stated, it would be awful if the Palestinian state started and things settled down. And the group in unison said, God forbid. And what that should do is really explain Hamas's dedication to, one, destroying Israel, but two, having complete and total power over the Palestinian cause.
No, thanks, Laura. And we're going to get back. We're going to jump back into that U.S. reaction here shortly. But Amos, you were there in Gaza when Oslo was signed. Like, your perspective is so unique. Can you tell us a little bit about what you experienced, what happened?
So first of all, when they were negotiating in Oslo, it was like a closely held secret. I remember the day that it was announced, we were, wow, maybe there really is hope here. And then when I was brought into it, to the implementation, I viewed it as an extraordinary privilege and honor because I happen to believe in peace. And I thought that this was going to be not only a unique professional opportunity, obviously, to be, present at the creation. And I think that I can't speak for others. I can speak for myself. I participated in the very first meeting after Cairo was signed in May of '94. And in retrospect, there were too many Israelis and too many Palestinians. But what was clear to me at the end of that first meeting is we were not on the same page. We from our perspective as Israelis, we were already in the peace process, and the Palestinians were still caught in this occupied paradigm. And that was jarring for me because I thought we had, bridged that. That's the first thing. The second thing, and I've written about this also, when the implementers came back from Oslo, when the architects came back from Oslo, they never met with the implementers. And that was a serious mistake on their part because we were given what was called the Gaza-Jericho Agreement. And I, as the lead lawyer responsible for implementation, I had no idea what those who had written the thing actually intended. And that was a significant problem. And so then when we started meeting with the Palestinians and we met, with representatives from the Palestinian Authority, there was nobody ever from Hamas. And I remember having a conversation with one of the lead Palestinian Authority negotiators with whom I spent significant time with. He said to me, it was interesting. He said to me, I don't remember if in Hebrew or English, he said, leave us alone until we get our own house in order. And what he clearly meant was until the Palestinian Authority and Hamas figure out exactly what's going to be the nature of their relationship, if indeed there will be a Palestinian state. And where are we? We're in 2025, obviously a year and a half after October the 7th. And it's clear that the PA and Hamas have yet to work out exactly what their own house is. And his comment, what was it, 30 years ago, was prescient. And he was right. He himself also was the victim of an attack by Hamas because he held a senior position in the Palestinian Authority. He was physically attacked. He was shot. And I think that I can only testify to myself. I don't think we really fully appreciated how Hamas would feel in the vernacular, shoved aside, not incorporated, not included. Was that a mistake by Arafat and Peres? I don't know enough. I'm putting that out there. They were shoved aside. And then, when they won the election, was it, Ms. Burns, 2004, 2005, Hamas wins democratically. And they won, I think, in large part because the population of Gaza was fed up, sick and tired of the PA's corruption. And I remind all of us, Hamas won democratically. I mean, the Hamas of today was democratically elected by the people 20 years ago. Need to remember that also. But when we started, we were focusing exclusively on the PA, Palestinian Authority. Hamas was committing acts of terrorism. And I'll leave that to historians have a different perspective on this. Maybe in retrospect, it was a mistake to, do this to them in spite of the charter. I remind all of us, Arafat himself took him a long time to say that he doesn't call anymore for the destruction of the state. I mean, the PLO also had its bid on that. And he, kicking and screaming, came to that conclusion. Hamas did not. And I don't think we really fully appreciated the extent to which they would be a counterforce. One more word and I'll be quiet. The other thing we can get into this, we didn't take into consideration, I think, whatsoever, would be the violent reaction of Jewish terrorists who also played a key role in impacting this negatively. That also needs to be very clearly stated.
No, you're absolutely right. We'll talk about that shortly. Two quick questions just on what you discussed, and I think we'll come back to the departing Gaza. You said you're the lead lawyer for the implementation in Jericho. Can you
In
be more
Gaza.
specific? Because in Gaza. Okay, Gaza. Gotcha. Uh, Going back to you say you mentioned the departing Gaza. Okay, what can you say about that? Their celebration by the people
Oh, sure.
for Israeli.
I'm in one of the last cars that leaves we don't use the word in Hebrew withdrawal, but we'll go with withdrawal, right? We don't use that word. We pulled out, whatever adjective, right? Um, I was in one of the last cars, and I remember when we were driving through, leaving the IDF base where we were stationed and going out towards the Erez checkpoint in northern Gaza. People were out on the street, I don't remember if they were throwing olives at us. We were asking ourselves, well, there were three of us in the car. I didn't know if they were going to throw stones, Molotov cocktails, or they're throwing olives, grapes, olives. It was like a celebration. There was this sense of, yalla, we can turn the page and we can move on. I remember that distinctly. It was overwhelming. It was obvious that we were Israelis because we had, the license plate was obvious. And they were not, they were celebrating, they weren't celebrating us, they were celebrating us leaving, which I well understand. But they were doing it in a frankly, in a very warm and friendly manner.
Wow, wow, thank you. All right, Laura, coming back to you, you talked a little bit about the US-based Hamas presence and their reaction. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about the leaders in the US and how they oppose peace to Oslo?
Yes. So interestingly, during this time period, the first intifada leading into Oslo, the leader of the U.S. Muslim Brotherhood's infrastructure was Musa Abu Marzouk. He was based here in the United States, and he became the first Hamas political bureau chief. And you still today see him very prominently displayed with the Hamas political bureau and their decision making even today. So he was in charge of this U.S. based infrastructure, but he was away on business when Oslo was signed. And so the other members of the US based infrastructure called an emergency meeting. They actually planned on the date that Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin signed or had the ceremony on the White House lawn on that very day when the hope for peace was solidified in that document. The leaders of this infrastructure held a call and said, we've got a problem. And they scheduled a meeting, an emergency meeting among the leadership of the US-based Hamas infrastructure in Philadelphia that took place in early October of 1993. And we know about this because it was all wiretapped by the FBI and subsequently declassified, and it's in the public arena at this point. It was produced in the trial of the Holy Land Foundation that I referenced. So it's all on tape. It was in Arabic, but it's transcribed and it's public record. And in that meeting, the leaders, they recognized a number of points. They recognized that now that Oslo had been signed, that Hamas would be designated by the U.S. government as a terrorist organization. They knew that was going to happen. They just didn't know when. And they recognized the fact that in order to continue to support Hamas overall from the United States, they would have to take a number of steps. They would have to act covertly under the cloak of charity and human rights and civil rights, et cetera. But their goal was clear. They were absolutely in support of derailing this the compromise, this peace agreement, and they were going to continue to support the jihad, and they were going to set about undermining Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian self-rule. And they identified over this 2-day period all of the things that they were going to do to further that mission. Not the least of which was that they were going to continue to support the Hamas social infrastructure. And that was for the purpose of radicalizing the youth and the community there. Because with Hamas, I mean, the foundation of everything that they are is their social infrastructure. Because without the ability to radicalize the population and gain the hearts and minds of the population, they frankly probably wouldn't exist today. And so, there were a number of things, and we could talk all day long about what they agreed to, but the tenets were that they were going to derail the accords, they were going to undermine Arafat, and they were going to lie to the American public about what they were doing.
David, can I make a
Thank you. So
follow-up to that?
please do. Yes, sir.
So the Hamas as a social network, social services, 100% correct. And just one small example. In 92 or 93, we deported 415 members of Hamas from Gaza to Lebanon after the killing of Nissim Toledano, the border policeman. Then they were deported, and when they came back, a number of them we decided to keep in detention. The person who became the head of Hamas, Rantisi, I signed off on his detention order. At the end of the detention hearing, there were three of us in the room: Rantisi, myself, and the military policeman. And I said to Rantisi, spoke English like we do. And I said to Rantisi, can we have this? Can we chat? And I'm sure the military policeman was like, what is happening here? And Rantisi said, sure. I said, I don't understand you. You're a pediatrician. He was a pediatrician. You're a pediatrician. You have blood on your hands. He says, no. You have to understand. This is exactly to the point. There's Hamas, Azaldin al-Qassam, the military branch of Hamas, and there's the social services branch of Hamas. And I am head of social services. I don't have blood on my hands. We in Israel refuse to, if you will, to delineate between this Hamas, Azaldin al-Qassam, and this Hamas, the social services. We saw them as one. They saw themselves as two. I need to add, when he became the head of Hamas after Sheikh Yassin was killed, he himself was killed in a targeted killing, because we saw him as head of Hamas, not social services Hamas, but head of Hamas. And I think that's important. You're 100% correct. How they frame themselves as a social services organization. Absolutely correct. And that's really important in terms of understanding them.
And if I can add, so, they have, again, talking about operating under cloaks. So for self-serving reasons, people like Rantisi would claim that they were separate, right? Musa Abu Marzouk knew they weren't separate. And these leaders, frankly, all knew it. And there's even a recording from the mid-90s of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin in Arabic, where he's talking about the fact that all components of Hamas work together for the same mission. And I can't remember the exact wording he used, but basically he stated that one couldn't function without the other. And so, I think with Hamas, and we're going to, talk about their acts of violence that we're going to get to here in a minute, but they talk out of both sides of their mouth when it serves them.
That's right. They say Dawa Jihad are two different sides of the same coin, right? So Amos, you mentioned earlier, you talked about the Jewish extremists. Within months of the signing of the accord, a terrible event occurred at the Al Ibrahimi Mosque. What can you tell us about that event and how your colleagues that you were working with in the Palestinian Authority, how'd they react?
So Baruch Goldstein's killing of the 29 Palestinians who were praying on that Friday morning in Hebron, there are no words for the evilness of what he did. It's in the spirit of Kahana, which, by the way, is continued today by the now former Minister of Police, Itamar Ben-Gvir. Kahana is Kahana. The Kahana, the Jewish terrorism ideologue with their blood on their hands every which way. It was a terrible moment. I mean, first of all, these are 29 innocent worshipers who are, I apologize for the term, I don't mean to offend anybody, who are literally mowed down while they are in prayer. I mean, there's nothing more horrific than that. I think from their perspective, I can't speak for them, but I would imagine it gave pause. And I know that Rabin on that Friday, Saturday was giving serious consideration to shutting down literally the Jewish settlement of Kiryat Arba, which is where the extreme right-wing Jewish settlers live. It depends who you want to believe why he didn't shut it down. But I think it on the one hand, I mean, there are no words for what Goldstein did. On the other hand, perhaps you could also say that it reinforced the need that we've got to somehow solve this, because we can't continue like this. To say it cast a pall, P-A-L-L, would be an all-time understatement. And Goldstein, he became, for the Itamar Ben-Gvirs of the world, he became this revered leader, just like Kahana, who himself was killed in New York. And it really reinforced the determination, if you will, of the Jewish terrorists to derail in the same way that the Palestinian extremists derail. For me, they're one and the same. And I could go on about Jewish terrorism, David, until your hair looks like my hair. And their vileness, and I think that we have to be in polite company, ultimately leads to Rabin's assassination. I mean, there's a tuck connection here.
No, I see that. How did that event impact your relationships with what you were trying to do on the ground?
Rabin's
with the
assassination
Palestinian
or the
Authority?
murder of Goldstein?
No,
Goldstein
Yeah.
did not.
Okay.
Did not.
Okay. Laura, to you, how did this massacre actually propel the agenda of Hamas?
Well, it was, I think it was the moment that really changed Hamas's or allowed them, gave them a platform for what they were about to embark upon. The even the US based infrastructure leaders, when they had that meeting, acknowledged that the Palestinian people, for the most part, were extremely happy about the possibility of peace and the accords. And so Hamas wanted to derail them, but how do you go about it when you've got popular support? And this event, the horrible, murderous event by Goldstein, gave Hamas the platform to use to begin their brutal suicide bombing campaigns. They used that, like, look, your leaders in the Palestinian Authority are allowing the Israelis to murder Palestinians. It's their fault. And then they said about at the very end of the mourning period for those Palestinian worshipers, they conducted their very first brutal suicide bombing, targeting and killing a number of civilians, just a mass casualty event. And that was not the only one. They very quickly, proceeded with their suicide bombing campaign. And with every one of those, they use that kind of like their marketing and recruitment tool for, look at these heroes who died for the sake of the cause, and they raised them up. And but I do think that the event at the Al Ibrahimi Mosque really gave them the opportunity to do what they wanted to do, and gain popularity and gain support and kill.
Thanks.
I'd never thought about it in that context, because the next event that propels Hamas is when Israel did the targeted killing of Yehia Ayash, the engineer, in January of '96. And the immediate response to that targeted killing was a slew of suicide bombings on buses, January through May, which then in May, remember, we have an election, Paris, Netanyahu wins. Paris has been asked as whether he'd been asked whether he regretted the targeted killing of Yehia Ayash, because does he think that those suicide bombings led to his defeat? It's an interesting question, but you are absolutely right. So-called these markers, whether it's Goldstein or the targeted killing of Yehia Ayash, and the way that, to Hamas, to its credit, is able to use these events in terms of propelling their agenda forward, I mean, brutally and violently. But I think that's a really important point that you make. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'll just add on that. I mean, Marzouk, master strategist. I've said this in multiple formats. I really, the way that he strategizes and manipulates, and it's impressive, right? And I don't mean that, I like the acts of murder and violence and things like that, but his ability to plan 20 years in advance and strategize and work off of key events to further their agenda. It is really unbelievable how masterful they are at that.
In the same way that Sinwar was, by the way.
Yeah, I was going to say we see that even with the current conflict, just how
100%.
masterful they are with their
100%.
lead. So,
Totally.
Going back to the violence, Amos, this question's for you. We think we know the answer, but we want to know what your personal perspective is. How did it begin to erode that working relationship in the peace process?
It's an interesting question. We were, I think, largely able to, I think the word in English would be to disassociate from acts of violence while negotiating. There was one exception. We were meeting on a Friday afternoon with representatives of the Palestinian Authority outside Jerusalem, and there was a suicide bombing in Tel Aviv. And the question was, I mean, we're meeting with them, and there was a suicide bombing in Tel Aviv at a restaurant. And the question that we discussed with them openly was, do we continue or do we take a break? And history will judge. We ended that meeting immediately. Is that the right thing to do? I leave to others, because maybe the right thing to do in the face of violence like that, which was committed by Hamas, is to continue meeting with the Palestinian Authority to try to resolve this. but the head of the Israeli delegation, the head of the PA delegation in that particular meeting decided to wish everybody, Shabbat Shalom and to go our respective ways. I participated, the flip side of that, David, is I participated at least at 2 occasions in meetings, high-level meetings in the immediate aftermath of the killing of IDF soldiers. And to call those stress would be all-time understatement, because we had senior commanders whose soldiers had been killed and were a step away from going to their funerals. And those were heated, I think, in polite English. But on the other hand, on the other hand, in spite of what had just happened, literally, we met. And I think I always found, in spite of the awfulness of what had just happened to the Friday, it was 2 consecutive Fridays. And we met on a Saturday night. It was heated, but we met. And I thought that to be an affirmation of the validity of the process.
That had to be difficult. You actually had to be professional, disassociate those acts of violence from trying to get the job done.
That's exactly right.
Wow.
Yeah, sure.
Wow. Laura, to you, what are your observations of how this extremist violence impacted the possibility of peace and, of course, hope for a Palestinian state? Just strategic overview.
I think that certainly Hamas knew what it was doing, and like as we've said, they would conduct one of these attacks, kill civilians, and then, of course, the Israeli government would have to retaliate against the militants. And then with that, Hamas would come out and stand. I like to use it, not literally stand on the bodies of the dead, but really use them as a platform and point to the dead. And say, look, what your leader, Yasser Arafat, and the Palestinian Authority allowed to happen. And so it was, helping them create hatred and the desire for violence against the Israelis, but also undermining the Palestinian Authority and blaming them for the dead. Meanwhile, Hamas, elevated the dead to martyrdom level and praised them and used them as role models to convince children that they wanted to pursue the same path. And so the series of violence just increased, right? And with every event, they gained more support, and then they would, conduct another attack. And, sooner than later, and Amos referred to the killing of Yahya Ayash. He was Hamas's bomb maker. And frankly, he helped Pidge as well. He was this guy that really constructed these bombs that were blowing people apart. Their parts were hanging from power lines and roofs of buildings. And when he was killed, it was certainly an event. They used his death as a recruitment tool. Hamas did. This is a hero. Thousands of people came out. They carried his coffin on top of their heads, and the mother of Yahya Ayash actually spoke to the crowd and said, "You are all Yahya Ayash's," and a very powerful message to the youth to carry on where he left off. And the violence certainly never went away at that point.
I think if I can just add to that, he was killed on a Friday, and I remember getting the phone call that Yahya Ayash, the Mandis, the engineer, had been killed. Again, I leave this to historians, whether we fully appreciated the degree to which his killing would be, not a word in English, sorry, would be martyrized, and the extent to which it would be, I don't like the word, I apologize, would be used. I don't like the word. But again, I think Hamas on that note was extremely strategic in taking Yahya Ayash's murder, the targeted killing, and using it, to justify the suicide bombings January, May, but more importantly than that, in terms of a recruiting tool that I think from which they benefited, notwithstanding the fact that he had been the target of a targeted killing.
Yep, thank you. Laura, you had mentioned some of the bombings, and you mentioned PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. How many bombings are we talking about during that time when this existing peace agreement was in place?
So, the peace agreement was in place for a number of years, and certainly Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad conducted a large number of terrorist attacks, but we're talking specifically bombings. If you look at the period 1994, 95, 96, it was between 5 and 10 a year. These were brutal events, and against civilian targets, but they weren't the only attacks that these terrorist organizations were committing. And in fact, a young teenager, U.S. citizen, was shot and killed at a bus stop waiting to go home. They conducted those types of activities very frequently. So the violence did not go away. And I know we kind of mentioned Rabin, but I would like if we could go back to that topic. And I think Amos may be in a better position to talk about it than me. But going back, because there was a significant event, amidst all of this violence and the spread of hate that also, I think, impacted what was going on. But I think Amos probably better to talk about it than me.
About Rabin's murder, the assassination. So, David, do you want me to jump in? I mean, happy to this. I mean, not happy to.
Absolutely. That was my next
Horrible,
question.
horrible,
So,
horrible topic. After Oslo, Rabin as prime minister and Paris was the foreign minister, the hate-filled incitement against Rabin was just that, hate-filled. And there were a number of points along the way, including a demonstration rally in Jerusalem, I believe on a Saturday night, when on the balcony facing a crowd with people wearing, some of them wearing keffiyehs, mocking Rabin, calling for his harm to Rabin. Standing on the balcony were the following individuals: today's Prime Minister Netanyahu, the former Prime Minister Sharon, the former President Katsav, and the former Foreign Minister David Levy. Looking at the audience and not saying a word. That incitement and that passivity in the face of unhinged incitement will forever be a black mark on those individuals. The only person to walk off the balcony, to leave the balcony, was David Levy, who died a few months ago. Netanyahu, Katsav, and Sharon stay there the entire time. That is on Bibi Netanyahu. That is an X on his back forever and ever. Vile. The incitement against Rabin was unhinged, led by rabbis. And the Saturday night, there was a huge rally in Tel Aviv, with the final song before the rally ended was Shir Shalom, the song of peace. Everybody sang it, and the next thing, Yigal Amir assassinates Rabin. Nobody took the threat of Jewish threats. Nobody took the threat of Jewish violence against the Israeli prime minister seriously, particularly the Shabak, what was then the General Security Services, what is today's the Israel Security Agency. It's why Carmi Gilon, the then head of the agency, resigned. It was called the concept, the conceptia. The concept said that a Jew will not kill Rabin, and they got that 1,000,000,000% wrong. There are those who will say, well, it'll be 30 years this November, that not only that changed Israel then, the impact moving forward is immeasurable. Yigal Amir is in jail, obviously, for the rest of his life. There are those who would suggest that that was the beginning of the end of the peace process, because Rabin really was locked in on it. Now remember, in November 95, Peres becomes prime minister right away, and Netanyahu wins in May of 96. There are those who will suggest to you that Yigal Amir is the winner of all this. I should add that one of the great failings of the Israeli Ministry of Justice, I wrote a book on this, is that the rabbis who incited virulent incitement were not prosecuted. I think with maybe the exception of one, but they got a pass. And if you give incitement a pass, it legitimizes not only the incitement, the incitor, but also legitimizes the individual who acts on behalf. And there, the Ministry of Justice, again, I wrote a book on this, failed us. But the rabbis who incited, there were bumper stickers throughout Israel, calling for the violence against Rabin. And there were, again, a number of demonstrations along the way that, in retrospect, you ask yourself, how was this missed? And it was missed because it was, again, the concept said that a Jew will not harm a Jew. I mean, how naive or how whatever can you be? That Saturday night, there are no words for it. It was awful. And it was Jewish terrorism at its very, very worst. And we need to be honest about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, sir. And just for the audience benefit, what's the name of your book, in case anybody's interested in looking that up?
There are two that I address there. One is called Freedom from Religion, And the other one, I will quickly look for it. I will find it for you. But I
No,
talked about
that's
it. There are two books back to back that discuss this.
gotcha, gotcha. Well, while you're doing that, so you can think about, when was it finally determined that the the compromise reached under Oslo had been derailed, just like the extremists wanted? When do you think that was finally determined?
So if I can share a story, in November of
Please.
'97, the book is called Tolerating Intolerance: The Price of Protecting Extremism. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
In November of '97, I was sent and what was called a secret Israeli delegation to meet in Washington, D.C. with Palestinians. We all signed on a Sunday in the hotel. We signed a kind of equivalent of an NDA. We will never disclose, never disclose. The following morning, banner headlines in the Washington Post: secret Israeli-Palestinian delegations negotiating in Washington, D.C. Okay. And because I was the lead negotiator on the safe passage agreement, which were the two roads between Gaza and the West Bank, which we knew for Arafat, other than Jerusalem is the capital of Palestine, this road system, West Bank connecting to Gaza Strip, because that would be the essence of connecting the two disparate elements of the Palestinian state. The safe passage was the single most important part of the agreement. When you wipe away everything else from Gaza, Jericho. Okay, so we negotiate, and there were two Israelis, the lead negotiator and myself, and 2 or 3 Palestinians, and we spent 5 days together, along with 3 Americans who sat on the side taking notes. I guess they're all reporting to someone else. Thursday evening, we finished. We had an agreement. And there was David Levy, Abu Mazen, who was not yet the head of the PA, and Dennis Ross. Okay. And we presented what we had done, and Dennis Ross was like, you guys did it. Mabuk Mazal Tov. We went back, everybody went their separate ways, and we reconvened at the Rome Hotel in Jerusalem, I think Monday or Tuesday, for a signing ceremony. And when we got there, the lead Israeli negotiator said to me, Amos, you're the one who wrote it, give you the kavod, the honor, photo opportunity, make the parents proud. And it was all staged, right? And I gave the agreement to the Palestinian with who I'd spent 5 days with. We had been in the room together, and I gave it to him, and he said in English, in front of the cameras, he said, Amos, I've always known you to be very talented, but you'd all know the next word. But I never knew you to be a writer of fiction. Ah, well, what had
Yes. What does
happened
that
is,
mean? Yeah.
I told you we went our separate ways. He went to wherever he met with Arafat and showed Arafat what we had agreed on. And Arafat figuratively chopped off his head. A few years later, I met Mr. Ross in Cleveland, Ohio, and I said to him, you won't remember who I am, but I met you, X years ago. It was an honor to meet you, sir. He said, no, I remember. And he has written about that segment, I believe, in his book, because I think that's when the Americans, and Ms. Burns knows more than I do. I think the Americans, that's when they realized Arafat really wasn't serious about peace. That we had negotiated the most important part, other than Jerusalem as the capital. We had negotiated safe passage. We gave a little bit, they gave a little bit. I mean, tuck, the way it works negotiating. And at that critical moment, Arafat said no. And at that very meeting, this photo opportunity, whenever the hell that was, Monday or Tuesday in Jerusalem, the lead Israeli negotiator said, "Yalla, we're out," and we stood up and we walked out. It took a while for us to reconvene. We did reconvene, and ultimately the safe passage agreement was signed, and then it was in existence for a day and a half before there was a series of suicide. No, I don't know, suicide attacks, terrorist attacks on the West Bank side of the safe passage agreement, where the entry point was. And that was the end of the safe passage. But I think that moment when the Palestinian, and I had great respect for him. We spent hours together. I mean, there we were in Washington, right? And
Right.
he called it a work of fiction, even though it was a 50-50. I wrote 50%, he wrote 50%, right? Called it a work of fiction. I mean, I appreciate the compliment. I wouldn't know how to write fiction if you paid me. But that was the end. That was a brutal moment for me. I mean, not me personally, but a recognition that they weren't serious about this.
Right. Wow. Wow. Well, we are right on time, maybe a couple minutes behind, but I want to get your final thoughts on the problems that hate and violence, breed in this conflict. And we'll start first with you, Laura, and we'll end with you, Amos, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So, Laura.
Yeah, I mean, the spread of hate and the advocacy for violence against individuals or groups or ethnicities or races or genders, that should be unacceptable and not tolerated. Because when you begin to see the normalization of advocacy for hate and acts of violence against a class of people, that normalization is lethal. You know, we can all look at acts of violence and terrorism where, you know, you have injured and dead, wounded, and recognize that is a bad thing. We can all pretty much understand and see the evidence of it. But the spread of hate and violence is something that happens that we all kind of acknowledge is there, but then there's nothing that's really being done about it currently. And I think you kind of have to look at that like you would a shark. Like if you're at the beach, right? You're sitting on the beach, your kids are in the water, and you see that dorsal fin. Pretty much everyone on the beach can recognize the fact that that is a sign of danger. That, well, I compare that to lethal operations. But where the real danger lies is that force, that powerful, evil force that's operating underneath the water, that is not visibly identifiable as a threat. But that's where the danger is. And that is what the spread of hate and the advocacy for violence against a group of people, that's where the danger really is. And if you look at what's happening, has been happening, it began with Hamas, you know, driving that radicalization in the Gaza Strip and even in the West Bank in the early 90s, and how that, you know, progressed to the point where Hamas was democratically elected. If you look at what's happening in our country today with the open advocacy for a terrorist organization and the open advocacy for acts of violence against the Jewish people, that is a dangerous thing when that narrative and those sentiments become normalized and acceptable in our society.
Right? Seeing Hamas flags, Hezbollah flags on campuses. Yeah, we didn't see that Al Qaeda flags after 9/11, but we're seeing that today with Hamas and Hezbollah. Amos, we'll end with you before we take questions. What are your thoughts on that?
So for me, as an Israeli, everything in many ways begins and ends with October 7th. What happened that Saturday morning, you graciously referenced that I'm the only child of two Holocaust survivors, and I hate the comparison. But there are things that happened on October 7th and have happened subsequent to October 7th that are Holocaust-like. The sexual violence against the women is Holocaust-like. And probably nothing is more sharp or clear than the way that Hamas murdered the two babies. They strangled two Jewish babies to death in the tunnel and then mutilated their bodies. That needs to be stated clearly. That hasn't happened to Jewish babies since the 1940s, and we all know how that worked out in the Holocaust. You want to kill soldiers? You know, we've all been there. You know, as we say in Yiddish, Zeitgesund, it happens. You cannot strangle two babies, and then you cannot mutilate their bodies. And that, for me, is, in terms of this extraordinary conversation, I want to thank the two of you for, inviting me. How we work our way backwards or forwards, depends how you want to look at it, from October 7th, is one of the great questions. I will finish with this. As we speak, I believe there are still 60 hostages held. And this is unrelated to this conversation, and I hope I'm not offending anyone. The fact that they're still being held is so beyond outrageous. There are no words for that. And they need to come home. For me as an Israeli, there's nothing more important than that. And that, for me, is what keeps me up and wakes me up, is the fate of the hostages and the two babies. I mean, I woke up last week at 1 o'clock in the morning to watch the IDF spokesman disclose to us how they were killed. He was very careful, very cautious how he did it. Didn't leave much to imagination. And for me, that's, in terms of our conversation, those two babies, you know, on a program on extremism, this extraordinary program you have, that's what it leads to, is strangling babies in a tunnel.
Yes, sir. I echo what you said about October 7th. I was there, stationed in Israel with the FBI at the time, and I think just like 9/11, there's a time before October 7th and time after October 7th. That those 2 days will live forever for me. So we are down to about 10 minutes, and I want to take at least 5 minutes of questions. So, audience, if you can think of some questions and put them in the Q&A section, I will go there. It looks like we have a couple now.
David, if I may, I see there's one about Marzook. Could I take that one?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Please take it. Yes.
Okay. So I see the question is, what are your thoughts on Marzook's recent comments about October 7th in his interview with the New York Times? And if any of you have not read that, so Marzook actually came out and stated that had he known the devastation that the Gaza would face, he could not have supported the attacks on October 7th. And what I will say to that is Marzook has a history of talking out of both sides of his mouth. Marzook is a master strategist. He is a manipulator. He's a liar. And he will say whatever he needs to say to provide cover or, give himself time to further his next item on his agenda. But the one thing about Marzook that you can pretty much bank on is that what he's saying, especially saying that would appeal to interests of the American government and the American people, they're not true. The question should be not whether or not Marzook's statements are true, but why is he lying this time?
Thank you, Laura. Let me take a look at this question here, and Amos, I'm going to direct this question to you. Okay.
Please.
There are reports today that Israel would like to prolong the current phase of the Gaza ceasefire agreement by another 6 weeks in order to continue the release of hostages and Palestinian prisoners. Firstly, from your perspective, if Israeli troops remain in Gaza and in the Philadelphia corridor, what are the immediate prospects for prolonging the first phase? And then there's a second part of the question. I'll get to it when you're done with that.
Let's begin with the first part because I'm not that smart.
No, of course, you are, but
To understand the hostage situation, what I'm going to say for Americans, I think is very, very, very difficult to understand, but it is what it is. The Prime Minister of Israel has no interest, no intention, no desire whatsoever to end this conflict. From his perspective, leave the fate of the hostages to the fate of the hostages. It's not of interest to him. The only thing that interests Prime Minister Netanyahu is political survival, not having his trial, not being convicted because the trial is ongoing in Tel Aviv District Court. He will understand that more chances are not that he's going to be convicted and may end up in jail. Nothing scares him more than that. The only thing that motivates Netanyahu is, again, political survival. The hostage situation to him is brush it off his sleeve, whatever. I'm sure that's difficult for Americans to understand, but it's the reality that we Israelis face. More than us Israelis whose family members are being held. I think they well understand this. They have to be careful how they state it because they understand that the only way that the loved ones can come home is through him. But the demonstrations on Saturday nights, the demonstration last night in Jerusalem, make it clear that many of us, obviously not all of us, many of us will understand that the fate of the hostages is something that is of zero interest to the Prime Minister, who's in a way caught in a bind between the extreme right-wing members of his government and President Trump, who I think would like to see this conflict end for other reasons, no politics. But the extreme right wing in Israeli politics, squeezes Netanyahu where it hurts, and he's got Trump here and them here. And I think that is as a result of which I see no resolution whatsoever. It is beyond unforgivable. That you want me to be polite, we'll leave it as beyond unforgivable.
you see any hope that phase 2 will be implemented?
First of all, I don't know this notion of, I saw that today is Monday, right? Ceasefire, but to what end? I mean, just ceasefire for a ceasefire to continue to like gum this way with no end in sight. The only thing that matters for me and for many of us, not all of us again, is the release of the hostages. And when you can play ceasefire, and yes, I know that IDF is talking about going back to Gaza. It's a lot of noise going on. There's a lot of background noise. I think that what's his name, Witkoff, the Trump's Middle East guy, has made it very clear to Netanyahu that this has to end. I saw was it yesterday, I think, that the U.S. is now sending $3 or $4 billion worth of aid. Rubio sending to, if I understand correctly, bypassing the Congress. I leave that to the two of you, not an expert on that. But this is all continuing it with no end in sight. And I think Marzouk, by the way, is 100% right. I don't know if Sinwar and Mohammed Def, who both now deceased, appreciated what would happen to the Gazan population. I mean, the Gazan civilian population has paid a horrific price for what has happened since October 7th. And I know you're right about college campuses, but at the end of the day, the blame needs to go precisely to Hamas leadership. I've said this elsewhere, so I'm comfortable saying this here. If you look around the world, the Middle East, you go to the West Bank, you don't see any demonstrations in favor of Hamas. You go to the Middle East, you don't see any demonstrations in favor of Hamas. The only place where you see demonstrations in favor of Hamas, a few places in Europe, obviously Columbia University you could have a different discussion about Columbia. And today, fewer and fewer college campuses, but they really were the beneficiaries of this being embraced. The river to sea and all that, I didn't understand it whatsoever, but it was a reality. But in terms of the hostages, I see tragically is an understatement of the year, no resolution whatsoever. And that is forever and ever and forever and ever on Bibi Netanyahu and on Bibi Netanyahu alone.
Thank you for that, sir. Well, we're coming to a close here. We just got a couple of minutes left. Before we leave, sir, could you repeat just the two books that you had mentioned?
Sure.
That you had written?
Freedom. Well, there are actually three. Is that okay, or am I overstepping? One is
No,
freedom.
please.
One is freedom from religion. The other is tolerating intolerance. And the third, which goes back to how you began about my parents, is called The Crime of Complicity, the Bystander in the Holocaust.
Thank you for that. And thank you so much for joining, you and Laura. I mean, your perspective from being on the ground in Gaza during this historic time period, and Laura's expertise on understanding how that impacted the U.S. Extremely relevant for today. We're seeing even the problems from decades ago, but they remain problems for both Israel and U.S. now, for calling for the destruction of Israel and support for that call. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us, to participate. This presentation, this event will be available, I believe, on YouTube, if I'm not mistaken. And I just want to thank you again for everybody. Have a great day. Have a great week. Amos, Laura, thank you so much for your participation
Thank
today.
you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.